They were known as the most powerful women in the world. They could heal the sick, control the weather, and even raise the dead. Sounds like a superhero, right? Well, not if you lived in 17th century Europe, because these women were burned alive for their so-called crimes against humanity. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out what really happened to the witches of New England. Before we get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And now, let us time travel back to early New England, where accusations of witchcraft would turn neighbors against each other and entire communities against themselves. Colonial Massachusetts was a hotbed for witchcraft accusations. The Puritans who settled here were deeply religious and superstitious people. They believed that witches were everywhere and that Satan himself was in league with them. In fact, the very first book published in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a manual on how to identify witches. So you can imagine how hostile the environment was for anyone accused of this crime. The Salem witch trials began in 1692 after several young girls claimed they had been afflicted by witchcraft. Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and Mary Black were just some of the young women who said they suffered from fits, convulsions, and strange illnesses. They also claimed that they saw strange animals crawling on them, indicating that they had been marked by a witch's curse. These symptoms were consistent with what we might call hysteria today, but at the time they were seen as evidence of witchcraft. So who did they accuse? Well, it started with Tituba, a Native American woman who lived with Reverend Parris, one of the ministers in Salem Village. She was a slave and as such an easy target for the authorities. She quickly confessed to being a witch and implicated two other women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. These two were also easy targets. Good was a beggar, and Osborne was an elderly woman who was shunned by her family. As the accusations grew, so did the hysteria. Soon, people were accusing their neighbors, friends, and even relatives of being witches. The judges presiding over the trials were convinced that there was a vast conspiracy of witches at work in Salem. In total, 148 people were accused of witchcraft in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. Of those accused, 19 were executed. 5 died in prison while awaiting trial, and many more were banished from the colony. One of the most famous victims of the Salem witch trials was Bridget Bishop. She was the first woman to be put to death for witchcraft in colonial America. Accusations against her began in February 1692, when several of the afflicted girls claimed that they saw her at a witch's Sabbath, where she danced naked and made pacts with the devil. There is no evidence that Bishop was a witch, but she was convicted on the testimony of the girls and hanged in June 1692. Another well-known victim was Martha Carrier. She was accused of being a witch after one of the afflicted girls claimed to see her at a witch's Sabbath. Carrier was also said to have confessed to witchcraft, but her confession was likely coerced. She was hanged in August 1692 along with 3 other women and 1 man. But why did these people confess to crimes they didn't commit? Well, sometimes they didn't have a choice. Many of the accused were tortured in order to extract confessions. This included beatings, sleep deprivation, and even forced nudity. Imagine being stripped naked and then forced to stand in the corner of a room while people hurl abuse and accusations at you. It's no wonder that some people would confess just to make it stop. But even those who refused to confess were often found guilty. The trials were a witch hunt in the truest sense of the word. The accusers were looking for witches, and they found them. In the end, the witch trials came to an end as suddenly as they had begun. By the end of 1693, most of the accused had either been released or executed. The colony was becoming increasingly unstable, and the governor was afraid that the violence would spread. In the end, it took the governor's wife being accused of witchcraft for people to realize how far this madness had gone. Finally, sanity prevailed, and the witch trials came to an end. After the trials ended, many of the victims' families received compensation from the government. But this did little to undo the damage that had been done. Accusations of witchcraft continued in New England long after the Salem trials ended. In total, more than 200 people were killed in Massachusetts alone for practicing witchcraft. But what actually happened to the witches of New England? Well, here's the thing, they never really went away. You see, the accusations of witchcraft were based on fear and superstition. People were afraid of the devil, and they believed that he had followers here on earth. Those followers were often women who were different from the rest, women who didn't fit in and were easy targets for the authorities. In a way, the Salem witch trials were a product of their time. The Puritans were a deeply religious and superstitious people who lived in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. They saw witchcraft as a real threat, and they took great pains to identify and punish those they believed to be witches. But that doesn't make them any less guilty of what they did. Today, we know that there is no such thing as witches. The so-called witches of Salem were simply victims of a religious frenzy. But that doesn't change the fact that they were real people with real families and real friends. They were real people who were accused of terrible things and punished in the most cruel and unusual ways. What's even more amazing is that despite everything they went through, many of the accused remained innocent until the very end. They didn't confess to crimes they didn't commit. They didn't renounce their beliefs or their way of life. They stood by their innocence and faced the music, so to speak. Perhaps the most tragic part of the story is that many of the accused were not even given a trial. They were simply arrested and thrown into prison, where they languished until they died. Others were tried and convicted on the flimsiest of evidence. The entire justice system was stacked against them. If anything, the Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale about what can happen when fear and superstition take hold of a community. They a reminder that we should always be wary of those who would exploit our fears for their own gain. These were real women who lived in a real time and place. They were not simply characters in a storybook. They were real people who had real lives and real loves. They were wives and mothers, sisters and daughters. They were healers and herbalists. They were midwives and wise women. They were people just like you and me. Yet somehow, in the eyes of the law and society, they became witches. They were labeled as witches and treated as such. They were persecuted and killed simply because of what people believed about them. And here's the kicker: none of them were actually witches. As we look back on the Salem witch trials and the other persecutions of suspected witches that took place in New England and around the world, we have to ask ourselves why. Why did these people believe that witches were real? Why did they believe that the devil had followers here on earth? And why did they do what they did to those they believed were witches? Well, there is no easy answer to these questions, but I think it is important that we ask them anyway. We need to remember the lessons of the past. If we are to create a better future, we must never forget the witches of New England. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this. Now, you might be wondering what happened to the village of Salem after the witch trials. To find out, check out this video.